miraculous story of the once and future heavyweight champion of the world.
John, thanks for taking the time today to talk about your latest project, Big George Foreman. Um, so I was particularly intrigued that there was two DPs on this. I mean, it's not every project that you have two different directors of photography. I'm really interested in hearing about when that decision started, like the conversations around that, and where you came in regarding that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, right, with George Foreman in his life. He's lived such a larger than life story. It takes such a massive amount of a group of people, I think, to tell that story. And so, I mean, when I came onto the project, there'd already been some starts and stops. Like originally this project was supposed to go, I think, before the pandemic, and then they were in prep and they actually they were down in New Orleans and there was a hurricane that hit production. So that kind of moved the dates as well, like another year. And so this project was one of those projects that was just trying to get off the ground for so long. And so I just feel really grateful that the timing worked out and I was able to connect with George Tillman. And I'm trying to think if it was the fall of 2021. Yeah, I just had a film come out, Old Henry. And so we got connected and we just immediately hit it off in terms of what the story meant, because with a story or a biopic, with someone like George Foreman that is like larger than life. Like his story is completely larger than life. At the essence of it, it's still a human story. And so I think we kind of really bonded with each other on that it was this human personal story. Like it's the small things that matter in his life.
So when was it discussed what portion of the film you shot? Because I assume you shot one time period and David Tattersall shot another, right?
Yeah, I mean, that decision, I think, was pretty organic in terms of the way the schedules aligned and everything. And so I kind of ended up shooting the earlier part of his life, from kind of in the 60s when he was fighting in the Olympics in Mexico City, like all the way through his fight with Muhammad Ali and then his fight with Frazier and then Jimmy Young, and then ultimately like his near-death experience. And through Foreman's near-death experience, he found his spirituality, and that's where the film kind of really kind of starts to grab hold of you in terms of his spirituality and him becoming a minister. And then there's this break, and then there's this 7-year break in the film in which we leave him and then we come back, and then he's the George Foreman that, at least for myself, kind of grew up kind of knowing or being aware of as this boxer who kind of later in life at age 45 came back and won the heavyweight title. And then obviously like every college dorm in the country had a Foreman grill. And so it's kind of, that's where the film was kind of going the whole time. And so it's just an organic process, I think. I was blessed to be able to kind of shoot those decades of his earlier life.
David Tattersall, I mean, I've been a big fan of his for a long time because I'm a huge Star Wars fan. And he shot all the Star Wars prequels. He shot The Green Mile, which is, I think, looks more beautiful even than Shawshank Redemption. I mean, I think Shawshank's a better film. It's an interesting choice. I mean, how did he get involved? And did you talk with him about what you had done? I mean, did he watch your stuff too before, embarking on his half so that he wasn't repeating what you had done, or I'm sure he was interested in what you had done so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that again, that was a very kind of organic situation, because I believe him and George had worked together on a film prior. And so, yeah, I mean, it was one of those things that we kind of from the Tillman and I from the very beginning kind of laid out this idea of like visually how we're going to move through these time periods, through the choice of lensing. And formats, whether were we shooting on some spherical lenses or anamorphic lenses. And as when he was younger and kind of the world was spinning around him and he was a little bit more out of control, we used more vintage lenses that kind of distorted the edges of the frame, distorting Foreman's own personal life around him because he was so kind of centered on one thing. And then through that transition, we kind of go to a more kind of, let's say, traditional or more contemporary look of kind of just cleaner lines. And so I think that once we transitioned, when he found his spirituality and his near-death experience, we kind of transitioned to more cleaner edges of frames. And for that, we used the master anamorphics. And then I believe the master anamorphics were used kind of through the end of the film for that. As soon as he kind of found his spirituality, we kind of centered things a little bit more visually. And so we kind of just like handed off and picked it up, you know?
So in a way, you kind of established where Tattersall would start with his half, right? The kind of the anamorphic, smoother, not so crazy look.
Yeah, and I think George, I mean, it's something also like, George Tillman from the very beginning wanted to have a natural break, this distinctive, different look to the film as well. And so I think it was just really, yeah, it's really fortunate, the whole process really. Yeah, it's exciting.
I'm excited to see it because going back to you talk about stages of life, I'm ashamed to say the George Foreman I know is the guy selling his grill on TV growing up. I don't know much about his story, so I'm excited to see that he even had a story. I didn't even know there was something there, that was interesting. And
Oh
I'm
yeah, he picked up boxing. He went to this, he picked up boxing at kind of a later, I don't know, maybe it was the right age, but he picked up boxing in this, by the grace of God, this mentor took him under his wing at the Job Corps, which was something that Lyndon Johnson had kind of put into place. Basically, these places where you could go and learn skills like being a mechanic, an electrician, and to be a part of the kind of American workforce. And so at the Job Corps, he was getting into trouble. And so you had this mentor that took him under his wing and basically said, like, I feel like there's some anger and some rage in you. Let me teach you how to box. And within a very short amount of time, he won the gold medal in the Mexico City Olympics. And then, it wasn't long after that, he was fighting for in the heavyweight titles of the world. So pretty remarkable in a very short amount of time.
That's really cool. Speaking of time, what was your shooting schedule like? Was it a quick one? Did you feel like you had the time to do what you need to do? Was it a run and gun kind of situation?
I mean, it was always ambitious. There was never, that was one of the things in my early conversations with the producers and with George, was that this was ambitious. We were going to be covering a lot of ground in a short amount of time because the total production schedule, I believe, was 50 days. And so it was a lot. But I will say that we were able to find the time and to have the time to kind of prep everything accordingly. And so by the time you're on set, it's more execution than figuring out or finding it. We had to be so kind of dialed in. And we just also had an amazing crew that just supported that vision from the get-go. I was fortunate enough to work with some longtime collaborators that had been with me for years. And so we just we knew what we were embarking on. But it was extremely ambitious. Even on a 50-day schedule, it didn't feel like a 50-day schedule.
It felt quicker, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm curious, like, to prepare before you started, what kind of films did you watch? I'm sure you, maybe even with George Tillman, or maybe George Tillman talked about some things he had in mind, I guess related to boxing, other films about boxing or sports.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, with like a genre like this, and ultimately, I mean, this is a story about someone who is a boxer. It's not necessarily a boxing story, I would say, but in and of itself, that is a type of genre, right? And so, it was so great to be able to go back and revisit these films that I'd seen kind of, early on or kind of coming of age, go back and really analyze Raging Bull for that. Like watching a film knowing you're going to embark on a similar themed film is a different experience than just watching it. And so, yeah, I think like watching, Rocky and Raging Bull and Cinderella Man, that was a film we also referenced too, because that was kind of this like someone kind of digging themselves out of poverty. We also really liked the look of that film, it felt grounded in reality and felt grounded in this organic texture, which was something we were always going for. And so, I mean, those were kind of the boxing films. And then, just because boxing and that time and these time periods were so heavily covered, it was great to kind of fully dive into all the documentaries and all the documentary footage that was around. So I spent more time watching probably a younger George Foreman in documentaries and kind of found footage than anything else, really. And in addition to the films we kind of watched and shared back and forth, there's also some really prolific photographers that I know George from the beginning was very keen on leaning into, from a color palette wise, from a texture wise. We referenced Eggleston and Gordon Parks, and then for me, there was this idea of bringing this iconic boxing photography to life, like in Neil Leifer. I mean, his images are what you think of when you think of Muhammad Ali. Like every single photograph of Muhammad Ali standing over his opponent laid out on the mat, that is Neil Leifer, and he just had this zeitgeist at the time, I think. He also was very prolific in football as well. He's got some amazing photography from this like bygone era. And so like his photographs they're just so evocative and so emotional. That was something that I was really kind of drawn to, and George as well. Like we had like I don't know how many binders and lookbooks we had of all this photography and research that really kind of keen. It really informed visually how we wanted to kind of uh, represent these fights, these iconic fights that everyone knows. Like the Rumble in the Jungle. Like there's not a single person alive at that time that didn't was not aware of that fight or hasn't seen images from that fight. And so, how are you as an artist going to kind of represent that, and kind of bring emotion to that? And so for me, it was like the window in, the thing that grounded myself visually, was that photography.
That's fantastic. More and more you're talking about it, the more excited I am to see it. So now I have a question more about you and your career. You have a Czech background. Did you have a specific Czech filmmaker, maybe like Milos Forman or Miroslav Ondřiček, I believe is how you pronounce it. Correct me if I'm wrong. Those people come to mind, but maybe there's someone else that was formative for you or you connected with when you were younger.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in film school, I had the opportunity to study a semester abroad. And so I studied abroad at the FAMU, which is the Czech, basically, National Film School. And so that was really pivotal, I feel like, for myself as a young upcoming cinematographer. It was I always say that was the summer I learned to what a close up meant, like the power of a close up and when to use it and when not to use it. The restraint that we have to have in order to really earn our close-ups. I mean, obviously, I was a young cinematographer thinking these things, but it was just something where it changed the way I viewed lensing and lensing a project. And so for me, there was like two films. It was Loves of a Blonde, which is one of Milos Forman's earlier black and white films. It was just kind of raw and just kind of out there. I don't even know if it's appropriate these days, but it's such a kind of a raw, honest film. And then also, I remember Fireman's Ball. Again, these are not big kind of cinematic films, but they're just these honest stories that are grounded, and you just feel the characters. You feel the earnestness of these characters, and so those two films in particular are pretty. I hadn't really seen any films like that, I don't think, um, prior to that. I'd been kind of familiar with, like, Larry Clark and his kind of indie wave and his indie films that he was doing, and Harmony Korine and stuff like that were kind of looking at, the American youth in this country, but to kind of look at it from a different perspective, from a Czech perspective of what they were viewing their youth like in the 60s. It's really interesting, really formidable.
And my last question is a bit of a non sequitur, but I've been working on this Exorcist documentary for the last 4 years, and it's my favorite film. I always like asking anyone in the film industry or anyone into film what their thoughts are on the film or their experience with the film the first time they saw it. And usually everyone has something to say. So, what do you have to say about The Exorcist when I bring up the title?
I mean, that was a film that I didn't see it at a too young of an age. I think I was when I saw it, I was already aware of, like, oh, this is a thing. We are watching this thing because it is a thing. I didn't like kind of discover it, if that makes sense. And to me, what I found the most interesting thing about The Exorcist was kind of later on all the stories that kind of came out around the making of The Exorcist, and how there's so many things that happened. You're like, Um, it's like art imitating life, life imitating art. That kind of constant loop, and so I find that fascinating. I also find it terrifying. I think it's a really, that was just a really kind of golden age of cinema. I feel like for American cinema in particular. I remember, I think the first time that I was saw the steps in Georgetown. My wife, she's originally from Northern Virginia, and so like anytime we go to the East Coast, we're always going to Georgetown. We always have a good night out in Georgetown, and so it's always a reminder of like, oh, you're driving by, you're like, oh yeah, those are those steps, that are made famous by that film. Um, but yeah, it's one of those films that just it doesn't hold back, and it went for it. And I think we need more of that. And I think we're starting to see more of that in cinema now. But I think we need more of that, more cinema, if that makes sense.
I agree. I agree. Well, John, this has been fantastic. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the movie when it comes out.
Absolutely.
It's now or it's never.